I wasn't looking for ships. I was looking for harbors. Specifically, I was tracing the construction timeline of a port facility in Odessa on the Black Sea coast, built according to official records sometime in the early 1790s. Stone quays, massive dock infrastructure, and warehousing complexes of an implausible scale for a port that had barely existed on European maps a decade earlier. This is the kind of infrastructure you build when you expect to receive cargo at a level the official trade records of the period simply cannot account for. So I started asking the obvious question: what ships were using this port? That question led me somewhere the official history of naval engineering refuses to go. What I found buried in the shipyard records, the Admiralty archives, and the private logs of Baltic and Black Sea merchants from the early 1800s were references to vessels. Not the vessels we are told existed, not the frigates and schooners and modest merchant brigs of 18th century Europe, but something else. These were ships of a scale and construction sophistication that should not have existed given the technology we are taught was available. Then I found the dry docks. Dry docks are specific. They are not flexible structures. You build a dry dock to fit a defined category of vessel. Too small and the ship won't fit. Too large and the infrastructure cost becomes prohibitive. A dry dock tells you with engineering precision exactly what size ships were being built or maintained at any given facility. The dry docks I found in Odessa, in Sevastopol, and in ports along the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Eastern Mediterranean were built for ships that, according to the official timeline, should not have existed. These were not slightly larger, but substantially larger vessels in the 400 to 600 foot range, built to specifications that naval engineers of the supposed period could not have designed or executed with the tools we are told they had. I want you to hold that number, because everything that follows depends on one simple fact: dry docks don't lie. The official history of naval engineering has a clean story. It goes like this. Ancient civilizations built small coastal vessels, medieval Europe developed modest sailing ships, and the age of exploration produced larger, more sophisticated craft. By the 18th century, European powers were building impressive warships, 200, maybe 250 feet in length, with complex rigging and cannon armament. By the 19th century, steam power begins to transform the industry. By the late 1800s, you start to see truly large vessels, iron and steel construction, and industrial-scale manufacturing. That is the timeline, clean, linear, and progressive, with technology building on technology in an orderly march forward. Except the physical evidence doesn't support it. When you examine the port infrastructure of the early 1800s, not the ships, but the ports, the harbors, the dry dock facilities, the stone quays, and the warehousing structures, you find engineering designed for a scale of maritime activity the official timeline cannot accommodate. The port at Odessa, officially constructed beginning in 1794, contains stone infrastructure that the Russian Empire's documented engineering capacity in the 1790s should not have been able to produce. The main quay wall, a continuous stone structure of extraordinary length, was built using cut stone blocks averaging 6 to 8 tons each, set with a precision that requires tools and techniques not documented until decades later. The official explanation claims Russian engineering was simply more advanced than historians credit. Fine, except the same explanation has to be deployed again for Sevastopol, and again for Constantinople, and again for Alexandria, Hamburg, Rotterdam, Lisbon, Liverpool, and London. Every major port of the early 1800s contains infrastructure that strains the boundaries of its supposed period's technological capacity. All of it was built simultaneously across competing empires, with no shared documentation, no common engineering manual, and no record of how the techniques were transferred. Unless they weren't transferred. Unless they were found. Let me tell you about the Livorno registers. The port of Livorno on the Italian coast maintained shipping registers from the 1600s forward. These registers recorded vessel arrivals, departures, cargo declarations, ship measurements, and routine administrative documentation of the kind historians rely on to reconstruct historical maritime commerce. In the records from approximately 1780 to 1815, there are repeated entries for vessels described with measurements well outside the range of what period-appropriate shipbuilding could produce. These vessels were described in the register's own terminology as of extraordinary burden, with documented cargo capacities requiring hulls in the 400 to 500-foot range. They arrived from ports in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, ports that are clustered precisely in the regions where Tartaria's documented presence was strongest. After approximately 1815, these vessel types stop appearing, the entries normalize, and the ships become the modest, period-appropriate vessels we are told should have existed, fitting the official timeline cleanly. The transition isn't gradual, it is abrupt. One decade, vessels of impossible scale are arriving and departing, and the next decade, they are gone. No historian of maritime commerce asks where they went, no one asks where they came from, and no one questions why the port infrastructure was built to accommodate vessels that officially should not have existed. I need to establish what Tartaria actually represented in the historical record before we go further, because this is not speculation, it is cartography. Tartaria appears on European maps from the medieval period onward as a designation for an enormous territory spanning northern and central Asia. It was not a vague regional descriptor, but a named entity with enough internal coherence that European encyclopedists in the 18th century treated it with the same casual specificity as France or Spain. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica devotes a substantial article to Tartaria, describing territorial divisions, noting administrative structures, and referencing its reach across the northern Asian continent. Then it disappears. It does not vanish through conquest or through documented political transition. The maps of the 1800s simply stop using the name. The territories get redistributed to Russian expansion, to Qing dynasty reach, and to various colonial designations. Yet the transition is never explained. No war accounts for it, no political documentation notes Tartaria's dissolution. Just the name, gone within a generation. What persists is the infrastructure. The ports of the Black Sea coast, the Caspian, and the far eastern reaches of what was called Tartarian territory still exist. The stone is cut, the dry docks are built, and the harbor walls stand. No adequate explanation has ever been provided for who built them or for what class of vessel. Providing that explanation would require asking questions that lead directly back to the registers at Livorno, the dry docks in Sevastopol, and the ships of extraordinary burden arriving from ports that officially belong to a civilization that officially never existed. I need to disturb me most about this investigation. It's not the scale of the ships, it's what happens when you try to examine the evidence. The British Admiralty holds records from the early 1800s that include assessments of captured or encountered foreign vessels. These were operational intelligence documents designed to give British naval commanders accurate information about what they might face at sea. Some of these assessments, filed in the 1990s and early 1800s, reference vessels of foreign construction with hull dimensions falling significantly outside the range of period-appropriate European shipbuilding. The assessments describe these vessels as of uncertain origin and advanced construction. They describe hull geometries requiring calculation methods not yet established in European naval architecture, and rigging configurations whose efficiency, in the words of one assessor, exceeds what our current mathematics can fully account for. These documents exist, cataloged and accessible to researchers with the appropriate credentials, and yet they are cited in exactly no mainstream history of naval engineering. They are not disputed, not reinterpreted, not cited and dismissed, they are simply ignored. I have come to recognize the texture of this kind of silence. Suppression implies awareness, a deliberate choice to conceal something. Institutional ignorance is different. It's the quiet consensus that certain questions aren't worth asking, that evidence contradicting the timeline is not evidence but rather noise, anomaly, or administrative confusion. The dry docks were built for ships that, according to official record, didn't exist, and the official record has decided that is not a question worth answering. Let me tell you about Voronezh. In 1696, Peter the Great established a shipyard at Voronezh, inland Russia on the Don River, ostensibly to build ships for his campaign against the Ottoman-controlled port of Azov. This is standard history, well documented and uncontroversial. What is less discussed is what was already at Voronezh when Peter arrived. Contemporary Russian accounts, not the official court histories, but the administrative records of regional governments,